Okay, so what do you need to actually solder either a BlueMicro or a keyboard? So for BlueMicro, especially if it's one pre or partially assembled, you're going to need a few tools. And the tools generally are all what you need for soldering or anything like that. So first you need like a good well-lit bench. And because my bench is wooden and I don't want to damage it further than it is, I use typically something like this is a silicone mat that I got from, well, AliExpress in China, but you can use like any surface that you want to put on top to protect your bench. Now, the other thing that you will need are things like a soldering iron. So over the years that I've been using soldering irons, there's actually one that I bought recently that I like quite a lot. Is this little Chinese one, the TS100. And to power it, like you can just like use like one of those barrel adapters. But what I use essentially is one of those laptop power supplies, like 19 volts, like about 3.5 amps, and it's got just one of those like pretty basic barrel adapter that you just plug in, and that's it. And obviously, you need the proper adapter for your mains. Some people like use these with like lithium-ion batteries or like battery packs for like portable drills and so on, but like I just leave it, plug it in because it's at my bench. So let me plug it in here. Now, what other tools that typically you would use? Well, because we're soldering, we need solder. So I typically use what I have here that I've been using, and as you can see, it's getting down to the last layer here on this reel. 22 gauge, or like about 1 millimeter, a bit less, like 0.032 tau, or thousandths of an inch diameter. It's no clean from MG Chemicals. It's a 6040 like tin lead. It works very well. I have no problems with it. I like it. And I got like more, like a whole, I've got a whole bigger one here, which is going to be the next one. This one I think is 6337. That's the, and it's essentially also either a no clean, or there's a bit of flux in it in this one. Actually the same amount, but it's a different type of flux. So this is essentially what I use for solder. Quite often, when you put solder in, you have to unsolder things. So very useful is a desoldering pump like this. This works very, very simple. It's essentially, you crank it up, you apply heat, it melts, and then this sucks. It literally pumps out the liquid solder, and it liberates the solid parts. Another tool that can be useful as well is what's called solder wick. This works, essentially you just put your part like you want to unsolder, and you just essentially heat it up, and because it's a very, very fine braid of copper, it literally wicks the solder away. I used this. This is in some situation it works better than a pump, but typically for I use a pump much more often because of the vacuum effect. It literally picks a lot of metal very quickly. It's handy to have both. Now, when you do solder like the TS100, the tips are actually very, very important. So the tip that I use the most often is what's called the chisel tip. It's like, if you look here, it's kind of flat one way and like an angle the other way. I also have a couple more tips available, and they kind of look like this. So this one, some people recommend like a very, very fine tip for a surface mount. Actually, I've used it before, but I still always kind of go back to the chisel tip because it just works better. Another tip that I have is kind of one of those. Another tip that I have is one of those angled ones that it's kind of round, like flat on one side, and it kind of heats like very good a whole surface. These for surface mounts, sometimes they're used. In some cases, some people like put a little hole to make a little like solder well to like essentially pull the solder away. I've never really done this before with it, but I have it in case I need to use these. As you can actually see from the coloring, the discoloration, I use this this chisel tip a whole lot more than anything else. To hold your soldering iron, because you can't, it gets actually pretty hot, you need some kind of a tray to actually just like lean it up. This works very well. I think it came with it. And to clean the tip, there's actually a couple of methods you can use. You can use a wet sponge. Actually, I've used a wet sponge quite a lot, but more recently I've actually gone with this like copper braid that essentially you just like as it, when it's hot, obviously it's not hot right now, but when it's hot you just like just brush it like this, and it literally cleans the tip of the iron very, very well. And I have had pretty good success with that. So from a soldering and unsoldering, this is essentially the tools that you need. Now, typically for keyboards, when it gets to troubleshooting, very often a multimeter, something similar to this is going to be very useful. This is a really inexpensive one from China. I actually got two of these because they were so inexpensive. I got one in the office and one in the basement. It just, like, they're like inexpensive. It works perfectly. It's got all the modes that I need. Like over the years, I've used quite a few multimeters, like inexpensive ones, like run some from even Radio Shack from years and years ago, and like they last like forever. So these are pretty useful. Another thing that I found useful, especially if you start dealing with very small parts, and if you're like me, slightly getting to the age where you need glasses to see closer by, some kind of device to put on your eyes to magnify is going to be useful. Or I've even made myself, because I use prescription glasses, literally prescription glass with essentially like reading glasses with prescriptions. That's what these are. And they've got quite a bit of a magnification compared to my standard glasses. So those I can't even like use to like see across the room. They're really like meant to be really, really close by. But I actually like them a lot because you put them on just instead of your regular glasses, and now you've got magnifying vision. That works very, very well. And these are essentially the tools that I use. So soldering iron, something to unsolder, something to troubleshoot. This is very useful. Some of the features that I use a lot, obviously volts. The continuity testing, wherever that like it beeps, that is super handy to check for shorts. And that's going to be useful for even testing the BlueMicro. And then essentially something to clean your soldering tip, something to hang your soldering iron on. Other things that can be useful as well, there are things like tweezers. And these are very useful, especially if you have to deal with surface mount components, but I like these quite a lot. Another thing that's actually can be very useful that I do use is painter's tape or masking tape. This one is like from Home Depot, but you can probably, they all like behave pretty much the same thing, the same way. And how I use this is to essentially, when I want to solder pins into a socket, I put the BlueMicro on top, but I cover it, put the BlueMicro, put my diode legs through, solder all the diode legs, pull the BlueMicro out, and I can unpeel the tape, and I know I've got all the pins lined up without having without the risk of soldering the BlueMicro to the socket itself. I've had that happen a couple of times, which had essentially it defeats the whole purpose of a socket for a BlueMicro. And that kind of covers pretty much everything, all that typically need. So soldering iron, this, other things you may need, like will typically be screwdrivers, Allen keys, all depending on what of use. But these are typically the more specialized tools that I have on hand for soldering. I do have other tools for surface mount, but I won't go into those today because they're obviously a little bit more advanced. These are essentially the basics of what you would need for like a really introduction for electronics, or for like building a keyboard. You might skip on one thing or another depending on what you have available, but typically all of this can be used for electronics, can be used for keyboards. It can be used like even for like repairing things at homes or anything like that. So that's these are very, very useful tools to have on hand. Well, this is it. Well, thank you. Bye-bye.